I have to tell you, it is always such a pleasure to come to Kerala, even despite whatever difficulties. It is such a pleasure to come to Kerala because you almost feel you can breathe again. That you are in a place where it's still civilized. It is still, there's still society as we know it. There is still everything that we value in life is still valued. So it is very much an honor and a pleasure to be here. I was just given a book by Naomi Klein on fire. And I have to tell you, our country is on fire today. It is actually on fire. I'm coming from a city, New Delhi, which yesterday police entered the campus of Jamia Millia Islamia University. They entered libraries, they pulled students out, not just beat them up, including women students mercilessly, threw them into jails. They had agents provocateurs encouraged by the ruling party to join the protesting students and then start throwing stones and burning buses, used that excuse to round up students, throw them into jails, beat them up, subject the women students to sexual harassment, and do all kinds of things because they were protesting a completely unconstitutional bill. This is just one of the many protests across the country. I don't know what is happening in other parts of the country because, of course, the other standard thing that they do now is to turn off the internet services. So it is not just Kashmir now. Normalcy is spreading beyond Kashmir. Normalcy has spread to the northeast. Normalcy has spread. Internet shutdowns are spreading also to Bengal, to West Bengal. Normalcy is being imposed in many parts of the country. Wherever citizens are protesting and not wanting this completely undemocratic, unconstitutional law to be imposed. As you all know, it's a very discriminatory law. And as you all know, it is something that actually goes against not just the Constitution, but the very spirit and idea of our country. But why is all of this happening? What's going on? Why is there such a mess? Why is the country on fire? And why is this fire being created and fanned by the ruling party and the government? Because let's face it, this is all being done by the central government. It was nothing was required. It was not necessary to do any of this. It is being created. Why is this happening? And I would argue that among the many reasons, of course, there is a broader Hindu nationalist project which is sought to be achieved. But among the other reasons is the urge to distract, and in fact the need to distract from the absolutely terrible state of the economy and the evident fact that they have no idea how to resolve the crisis. Because today in India, we have an economic crisis that is significantly worse than 1991 or 2008. And this is not just me. It is not just some crazy woman from an anti-national university called Jawaharlal Nehru University. This is everybody people who were formerly advising the same government, international economists, people who, even senior bureaucrats who realize what is happening. Everybody recognizes that we are in the midst of an unprecedented economic crisis. And this crisis is made much worse because it's a government that refuses to recognize it. So I used to think that the government is pretending that they don't know because they want to keep the media and everyone, they want to show that they are in control. And so they're saying everything is fine, don't worry, etc. But I now realize that they are saying this because they actually think it. They are in complete denial because they are not undertaking any of the measures that are necessary and possible, eminently possible, to resolve the crisis. So we have a very, very peculiar situation today. We have a very significant economic crisis. I will tell you the contours of that crisis in a minute. And we have a government that, first of all, is pretending that there's nothing wrong, everything is just fine, and it's all cyclical, and recovery has started, and all of that. And even if they admit that there's something wrong, they have no idea what to do about it. So they're doing all the opposite things. They're doing exactly the opposite of what needs to be done. And then when that doesn't help, as it obviously cannot help, then they they fuel communal hatred, they create other kinds of divisions and distortions, and they try and distract people with all the glories of past centuries and millennia past supposedly Hindu greatness, and somehow hope that that is actually enough to keep the thing going. Now it's not just a very serious situation, I think it's a kind of unprecedented situation. We've never really been in this situation before. So we have faced neoliberal governments in the past, and we have been criticizing these neoliberal governments. But we have to now admit in retrospect that they were competent neoliberal governments. We are now faced with an incompetent neoliberal government. So it's a whole different situation. So let me just try and explain to you the nature of this crisis. And I have to tell you that it is essentially this time a homegrown crisis. It's essentially domestic in its origins. The government will tell you that it's because global economy is doing badly. And it's true, the global economy is doing badly. And therefore we are also doing badly. But that's not actually the full truth. Let's understand what's happened in the global economy, then we will get a sense of our own situation and how the Indian economy has been affected by that, but how our own problems actually, in a sense, predate those and have a different kind of origin, and therefore we are much worse able to cope with what is definitely going to be bad news in the world economy. So let's just look at the world economy first. The first point to note about it is that, in fact, this world economy never really recovered from the 2008 global financial crisis. We were all told that there's been a recovery. You know, after 2010, we were told that especially Asian developing countries, we had V-shaped, that is, we fell, our GDP fell, and then we recovered very quickly, and we were still on a higher growth path. And that after that, the global economy once again has been picking up, and especially developing Asia is now leading the growth, and the United States. Now, in fact, what has happened? What has really happened is that the global economy did recover, but it recovered by doing the same set of policies that had got it into the mess in the first place. In other words, if you remember the global financial crisis, it happened because there was excess accumulation of debt, over-accumulation of debt in the United States and in Europe. And it was because basically the pattern of growth was very, very unequal. Workers did not get their share of the rising GDP. So workers' share of national income kept falling. And this was especially true in the US, but it was true across the world. Even in India, in China, in all of the major developing countries, everywhere. The share of workers in national income was falling. Now, what does that mean? It means that ultimately who consumes in an economy? It's workers, right? And that meant that there was less and less market for the goods that could be produced. The only way you could meet and create a market was to actually give workers credit instead of incomes. So instead of wages, you offered new forms of credit. Credit to buy houses, credit to buy cars, credit to put your children in education, credit for health facilities, etc., etc., all of these things. So the period from about 2003 to 2007 was marked by huge increases in credit to households and to companies. But basically, this was designed to make up for the fact that you're not giving them wage incomes. You're not actually increasing wage incomes, so you're substituting wage incomes with credit. Now, we all know that this cannot go on beyond a point. In other words, all these debt-driven bubbles, ultimately they have to burst. Either they burst like pop, bang, as happened in 2008, or they go slowly, slowly and get into a medium-term stagnation. We know that in the United States, the bubble burst. It started bursting actually in late 2007, but the final collapse came in September 2008, and there was a collapse in the debt markets. The problem was essentially in the United States, but it spread to the rest of the world. So even countries that were not involved in that boom, all of us suffered. Okay? All of our credit markets collapsed. All of us faced this dramatic collapse in demand. And of course, subsequently, then there was this problem that everyone who had taken on too much debt, you now have to get rid of that debt. You have to repay. So there are households that are trying to repay. There are companies that are trying to protect their balance sheets. What did the global solution consist of? When I say global, it's really the developed countries. It's really the United States, Europe, Japan, right? It's these, mainly United States and Europe. Even Japan doesn't matter so much. What did they do? How did they deal with this? They embarked on a massive, massive spree of what is called unconventional monetary policies. What does that mean? It means that the central bank gives endless amounts of liquidity to banks, not to people. They didn't, for example, tell people who had borrowed to buy houses that, okay, now you can actually, we are cutting half your debt, so that they could then go out and spend more. What they did was they offered banks vast quantities of liquidity, vast quantities of money, and said, now please go out and lend. And of course, the banks didn't go out and lend because they said, well, it's much more sensible for us to actually fix our balance sheets. Because bank balance sheets had been completely eroded and destroyed by the whole process that I've just talked about. So they said, now we're getting all this money for free at very low interest rates, 0 interest rates. Let's build up our balance sheets. So they did not create demand in the economy. The demand that did happen happened only at that point, just after the global crisis, because of public spending. Both the United States and Europe, they embarked on a significant increase in public spending. And in Asia, China, very, very sharp increase, almost 25% increase in government spending in China, some increase in India, in a bunch of other countries. And that kind of shored up the global economy. But after that, of course, we had a crisis in Europe, in the Eurozone. I won't talk about it now, but you all know that it was really a fallout of that same global financial crisis. It was banks that were heavily involved in that global financial crisis who then faced problems back home, and then governments were forced to take over those bad loans. They fell into fiscal deficit. They faced crisis. They had to contract their spending. What have we had since then? We have had this very weird combination of fiscal austerity and monetary loosening. So governments have not been spending much, but more and more monetary policy has been extremely lax, what's called quantitative easing in the United States. And it really means that you're getting endless amounts of credit available at very, very low interest rates. Because of that, from about 2012 onwards, you get, once again, people start borrowing. So the recovery that everybody talks about in the global economy is once again based on borrowing. Massive increases in borrowing by households, borrowing by companies, borrowing by everybody except small and medium enterprises who still don't get credit, but everybody else is borrowing, and that is what is keeping this global economy afloat. And we know that this again can't go on. There is a point at which this debt increases to the point where it's no longer viable and something happens to cause that debt bubble to burst. It's going to happen. There is absolutely no question about it. But what is more alarming in a way is that countries that didn't have that problem before, especially countries in developing Asia, we started doing the same thing. In China, the ratio of debt to GDP has more than doubled in the period after the global crisis. Between 2008 and 2016, debt to GDP ratios doubled, more than doubled, and every single sector, households, governments, provincial governments, banks, private corporations, everybody has been massively increasing their borrowing. In India also, we did something quite similar, if you remember. We also embarked on much more borrowing, which was in a sense forced on us by the fact that we had got rid of development banking, but I'll come back to that India part in a minute. But basically, across the developing world and the developed world, this recovery has been based on debt. And we all know debt-driven bubbles cannot last. We also know that that is now over. In other words, it's becoming harder and harder to generate growth just by providing credit. And so increasingly you are getting these, shall I say, problem spots emerging in the global economy, these potential crises areas which are coming up in the global economy, and each one of them, there is a desperate attempt to kind of cover it up and suddenly make it okay. We don't realize it, but some of the weakest things are the ones that appear to be the strongest. Recently, for example, Germany, the German finance minister, who had been completely against Euro bonds, common bonds across Europe, suddenly he comes up and announces that yes, Germany wants to start having Euro bonds. Why? What happened? Well, it turns out that Germany's largest bank, Deutsche Bank, is in deep trouble and actually is going to go under if, in fact, something is not done to revive it, and the safest way to revive it is Euro bonds that are backed by the European Central Bank. Similarly, there is a range of other crisis points across the global economy in the developed and the developing world. And we cannot say for sure where the impetus is going to come for the next big, I won't even say slowdown, because the slowdown is already there, but for the next big crisis. But we know it's going to come, it's going to happen for sure. Within the foreseeable future, it will happen. We already see global exports are down. People are blaming the US-China trade war for that. But in fact, global exports started coming down well before Mr. Trump came and started doing all his drama. Okay, so in fact, that whole process of stagnation turning into recession had already started. So there is no doubt the global economy is fragile. Developing economies as a group are vulnerable. There is a crisis around the corner. How long that corner is, I'm not exactly sure, but it is there. So yes, things are bad in the global economy. But what is more scary for us is that the Indian economy is actually in a much worse position to withstand such a crisis. In 2008, we were in a much better position. We could actually take measures to counteract that. Not only because we didn't have such a stupid government at the center at the time, but even because otherwise macroeconomically we had slightly better conditions. Today we are in a much more fragile and vulnerable situation than we were then. So let me then turn to what's going on in India. And I think what I want to impress upon you is that the Indian economy's problems are only very slightly related to the global problems. Most of the current problems of the Indian economy are directly a result of our own policy mistakes and the economic processes that have been underway over the last decade in India. So what exactly has been going on? Well, there are some medium-term issues. Let me call them, if you like, the kind of systemic or structural issues that have determined what has been happening in the Indian economy. The most evident one is a bit similar to what I described globally, which is to say that our period of very high growth was a bit of a strange period because it wasn't associated with significant increases in employment, and it was associated with large increases in inequality. That we all know, right? Even whether our official data get released or not released, it is evident that there was very big increases. But this increase in inequality begins from the 90s, but it really accentuates in the 2000s. So you get disproportionately growth being concentrated in the hands of the richer categories of the population in both urban and rural areas. It's not just the few large capitalists who build these crazy houses that are the largest personal houses in the world, like Antila in Mumbai. It's not just all of the other few rich in India who are the most visible face. It's not just the fact that today we can say that 0.1% of the Indian population controls 58% of the wealth. That's what the Credit Suisse figures tell us. It's all of that, of course, but we know that overall, there was a very significant increase in inequality. And a big reason for that is because this growth didn't generate employment. So even in the period when growth was actually, GDP growth was 7 to 10% every year, it varied between 7 and 8, 9, 10. Even in that period, employment growth was not more than 2%. Now, employment, the way we define employment, it's a very generous definition of employment. It is anybody who is doing anything on a regular basis. If you don't have a regular job in the rural areas, but you know your family sends you to milk the cows every morning, you are regularly employed. If you don't have a regular job, but you go around looking for various kinds of things, maybe you wash some cars in the morning and you do something in the, some activity, some vague thing in the evening in the urban areas, you are regular self-employed. So we have a very generous definition of employment. Even with that generous definition, only 2% growth per year. And of course, if you look at organized employment, the jobs you and I have, the kind, not just public sector, public, private, everything, the jobs that we would consider jobs, the jobs we would like our children to have, if you look at that kind of job, no growth, zero, no increase in organized formal employment. There was some increase a little bit in private formal employment and a decline in public formal employment. Decline. Okay, so on balance, no increase. So you're getting all this so-called GDP growth happening without job creation. And of course, that in turn means that there is less demand being generated in the economy. So that's one part of that medium-term picture. The other part of this medium-term picture is what is happening in agriculture. So Indian agriculture, ever since the reforms started in the early 90s, had been exposed to global competition, even as the kinds of basic protections that farmers everywhere else in the world get, those protections were being removed. So procurement price, after all, it's a protection. It's supposed to provide a floor for prices, for the prices that farmers get. That really no longer worked. Whether it is inputs or it is protection of outputs, or it is research and extension, or it is irrigation and public investment in water resources, or it is on-farm post-harvest activities, or it is on-farm livestock, all of these sectors that were neglected. From the mid-2000s, between about 2004 and 2009, there was some attempt to change that. So there was an overall decline in public spending towards rural areas and agriculture. Then in the second half of that first decade, there was a little bit of an attempt to revive it, but not enough. And then from about 2010 onwards, that means even before the NDA government, even before Modi, from about 2010, once again you see a decline. And so farmers in India have been having to face competition from very, very subsidized international agricultural businesses who can offer massive subsidies and therefore get much lower prices. Farmers in India are having to compete with that, while they are getting less and less and less in the form of basic protections. So ultimately what has happened, farming is no longer viable. And this got actually progressively worse over the last period. That is, since it had already started becoming bad. That is one of the reasons why when the BJP was campaigning in 2014, their big promise was to double farmers' income. I don't know how many of you remember that. We think it's a new promise because every year he makes the same promise. But it was a promise in 2014 that we are going to Achhe Din Aayenge. We are going to bring good days, and those days are going to consist of doubling of farmers' income and so on. In fact, things have got much worse since then. Procurement prices have not gone up along with inflation. But more than that, in fact, they don't really reach most of the farming community. Only about 8% of farmers actually get access to public procurement. And so procurement prices are no longer a floor for selling, for farmers who are selling. And on top of that, this government has had a very, in a way, anti-farmer policy because the focus has been on controlling inflation and controlling food inflation in urban areas. So whenever the prices globally of something go up, then we put an export ban. the government puts an export ban to prevent farmers from selling abroad. Whenever the prices globally fall, we allow imports. So basically, consumers, net buyers of some foods benefit, but farmers end up actually having to pay the price, that they cannot take the benefit of even price fluctuations, even when the costs are not covered by the procurement price. So there is this basic problem, and there is a whole bunch of other problems in agriculture, which I don't want to get into, but what it has meant is that agriculture, which still provides about half the employment for Indian workforce, and let's say livelihood for about 60% of the population, agriculture is not viable. It's not giving you net incomes. And that really means, therefore, that there is the 60% of the Indian population that doesn't have money to spend. So imagine what that is doing to effective demand. They have less and less money to spend, they cut down on their spending. So these are the two medium-term processes that were already in place in the Indian economy. And then, of course, we get these two master strokes of demonetization and GST. So demonetization, I don't have to tell you what happened. I think the extraordinary blunder that was demonetization is possibly fresh in everyone's minds, although the attempt is made to make everyone forget it. But it was a devastating blow to the Indian economy. It's not just that it was unfair, unjust, made people stand in queues to collect their own money. In fact, people died. We have all kinds of those terrible stories. All of that is true. But what it really did was a very major damage to the Indian economy by completely destroying the informal sector. This is an economy which, according to the government's own estimates, 98% of transactions are in cash. 98% are in cash. And suddenly you announce that 86% of this currency in circulation is not going to be there. So what happens? Transactions stop, basically. Yeah? And you remember that time, right? Transactions simply cease. And they particularly cease for informal activities, for these micro, small and medium enterprises. And that means, of course, immediate devastation, including in agriculture. Remember, that was just the end of the harvest season, beginning of the sowing season. Farmers couldn't sell their output, they couldn't buy the inputs. There was all kinds of mess there. But small-scale enterprises, traders, everybody, basically it destroyed economic activity. Now, that's a shock. That's an immediate, sharp shock. But what it does is create negative multiplier effects. You lose your ability to produce and sell today, you lay off workers. When those workers get laid off, obviously they cannot spend money. So they stop spending. The people who would have earlier sold to them cannot sell. They stop buying. That negative impulse permeates the economy. So we have these negative multiplier effects of demonetization which have persisted. So remember, this is a downward spiral that can keep going unless something stops it. Yeah? Because obviously people spend less, then the next person spends less, then the next person spends less. It's a downward negative spiral. What can stop it? The only thing that could really stop it is if somebody else, some other agent in the economy starts demanding. And who can that be? That has to be the government. That has to be the government. Public spending has to compensate for that decline in private spending. Now, the crazy thing is that that did not happen. The government did not start spending more to compensate for that decline in private spending. And so we got these negative multiplier effects persisting in the Indian economy. It's not just the demand, supply chains were broken. One of the things about Indian production is that formal sector is very closely integrated with informal. Many of them get a lot of inputs from the informal sector. A lot of their, the security, the other services, the catering, all of them are done by informal providers. So there's a very close linkage between formal and informal. When that informal collapses, the formal is necessarily affected. And supply chains were affected. Our exports started declining well before global exports. Our share of global exports has fallen. And one big reason for that is actually demonetization, because it destroyed supply chains. So that was another thing that then impacted on employment. There was an immediate direct effect, and then, as I said, there are the negative multiplier effects. Then, of course, this happens, as you all remember, on the 8th of November 2016. Remonetization, that is money back in circulation, didn't happen fully for a whole year. It took till November 2017 for the same amount of money to be back in circulation. So really the economy is still limping. It's still trying to cope with this absence of liquidity. And of course, all these attempts to digitize and move to non-cash and so on, they're nonsense, right? They don't work. I can tell you I cannot do a digital payment in my university campus because the connectivity is so bad. In Kerala, you're probably luckier. But I can tell you the national capital of Delhi, connectivity is a disaster. You can't actually do any digital transactions in Delhi. Okay, at least where I live. Okay, so the economy is still limping, and then what do? They say, we are going to bring in the GST. Now, we can have many views on GST. I know that Kerala supported it. I personally am against it because I think it's anti-federal. But whether we approve it or not, there is still a way to do it. Okay? Now, what was it supposed to be? A good and simple tax. That means very simple, straightforward, very easy to implement. Everybody knows it's very difficult to move from a system of, decentralized sales and customs and other duties to one unified GST. It takes a long time. Most countries that have implemented GST have taken on average 3 years. These are developed countries, Australia, Canada, Malaysia. They all took 2 to 3 years to implement GST. Our finance minister at the time, Arun Jaitley, says, no, we can do it in 3 months. So it was announced in April to be started from the 1st of July 2017. Now remember, this is an economy that is still reeling under demonetization. Now you implement a GST. And this GST is crazy. 8 rates. From 0 to 28, 8 different rates, and completely unbelievable criteria for the differences in rates. I remember going to a sweet shop in my neighborhood, and there were different rates depending on whether it was a milk-based sweet, whether it had fruit in it, whether it had chocolate in it, and whether it had nuts in it. 4 different rates in one sweet shop. Okay, you can imagine, and of course, this GST then had to be imposed. Those who had to actually meet the criteria, you have to give one set of returns every month online, one every quarter, and then one annual. So imagine the amount of money you now have to spend on accountants and people who can file all of these. So the tiniest little enterprise is having to spend 3,000 to 5,000 rupees per month on just these accounting fees. Then they said, we're excluding the small ones. If you have under 20 lakh, later it was made 40 lakh. If you have under 20 lakh turnover, you don't have to pay GST. That's fine, but then you will not be able to get tax credit to those whom you are supplying to. So larger firms didn't want to buy from these small firms anymore because they could not give them the receipts that would allow them to have tax credit. So once again, these are micro enterprises that have already been smashed by demonetization. Now you're giving them this other blow. Okay, this one didn't destroy you. Let me try that one. Okay. So it was incredible the kind of attack we have faced. I have to tell you, this will have resonance in Kerala. It wasn't just small micro enterprises. Cooperatives have been very, very badly hit. We have to look at the impact of this demonetization. The gender impacts have been very significant, both demonetization and GST. Demonetization, particularly, there was a gender impact because women, mostly 80% of women at that time did not have bank accounts in their own name. They were forced to rely on the men of the household. If they had kept cash in their little stacks of cash personally for particular use, they had to part with that. There were many cases of domestic violence that I personally know of, when women had to reveal that they had been saving up these small amounts and so on from husbands who would have used it for something else, for drinking or whatever. But GST also has very significant gender implications, particularly for the impact on women's cooperatives. I'm sure Kutumbashree you've managed, But I can tell you in many parts of the country, in Odisha and West Bengal, in Rajasthan, many women's cooperatives are actually have closed, are on the verge of closure because of inability to deal with the pressures created by GST. So here is one impact on demand from demonetization. Now you have another impact on demand from GST. And the same kind of impact again on supply chains, because you're breaking the supply chains. Corporates are saying, we don't want to go to these people who cannot give us the tax credit and so on. So as a result, you have created a situation, and it's entirely man-made. Two men made. It's entirely done by two men. This crazy thing, which is imposed on the entire economy and puts massive downward pressure in an economy where the medium-term tendency was already a slowdown and a stagnation in demand. Now add to that the problems in banking. And I'm going to just talk about that a little bit, and then I don't want to take too long because we have two other speakers as well. So what were the problems in banking? This again dates in a way to the 1990s. You know, in the financial reforms of the early 1990s, one of the things the Indian government did was to get rid of development banks. Okay, now that was a very, very stupid move, because development banks do things that normal commercial banks cannot and should not do. That is, they invest in long-term projects. You know, projects that are, let's say, for infrastructure or core industries. They have long gestation periods, they are often high risk, there's a lot of investment made all together, okay? Commercial banks are not supposed to do this. Commercial banks are supposed to provide working capital that they will get back regularly and all that, right? So development banks, if you destroy them, then you have to have somebody somewhere that is providing long-term lending. We destroyed ours. I can tell you that this is not necessarily all countries did that. China did not, Brazil did not, South Africa did not. Among the BRICS countries, we're the only ones who don't have a development bank. Okay? Not even one development bank. As a result of that, what happened? The government said, oh my God, now how do we fund all these roads and highways and infrastructure and this and that? So they started making our public sector commercial banks lend to these, to aviation, to energy, to highways, to transport, etc. Now, this is a problem. There is basically what is called a maturity mismatch. You are investing for long-term things with high risk, long gestation period, but you've got deposits where people can take them out any day, right? It's a maturity mismatch. There's a problem. And there is a chance that you will get, therefore, bad loans. And that, as we all know, happened. That started happening from about 2010, but they grew and grew and grew. The bad loans proportion grew. And of course, the bad loans were then assisted by crony capitalists who could take fraudulent loans. The Nirav Modis and all these other fellows who did the frauds, the bank frauds as well. But the bank frauds is only part of that broader problem of the NPLs, which comes about because these are commercial banks doing what commercial banks should not be doing. Okay, so already you have done this. Again, Mr. Modi comes to power saying that he's going to do this, clean up of the banks and sort out the problem. And when he came to power, the total NPLs in the banking system was 3.4 lakh crore. They are now 12.5 lakh crore. Almost four-fold increase. Okay? So he didn't really solve the problem. They have added to it. But how have they added to it? What's gone on here? And this is another fallout of demonetization that people don't really realize. So what happened? Remember demonetization? What did banks have to do? They had to collect all this cash, check that it is genuine, and keep it. So they got a massive increase in deposits, but at the same time, they have no time to give out loans. Banks were doing nothing but collecting cash and counting this wretched cash, if you remember. Immediately after demonetization for 3 months, there's practically no new credit because banks are just occupied doing this crazy thing. But on the other hand, things have to keep running in the economy, right? Working capital still is required. The small and medium enterprises still need some cash. You can't do without credit altogether. So the government encourages a shift to non-bank financial corporations, non-bank financial companies. You know, these are what are called shadow banks. That is, they don't take deposits. They borrow and then they lend. So the bank said, okay, we will lend to NBFCs because it's easier. That it's just one big loan I can give to one company. I don't have to look at individual loans anyway. I don't have time because my entire staff is counting currency notes. Okay. So banks start lending to NBFCs, and then in fact the NBFCs are effectively not regulated. So the government, in its efforts to try and counter the fact that they have destroyed the banking system by doing this crazy thing, they are putting the burden on NBFCs, and then they're saying, we're not going to look too closely at what you're doing, you just keep lending. What happens? Fraud happens, and then you get something like IL and FS. You remember? Infrastructure leasing and financial services. That's just one of the many. We have several now. So the NBFCs take over the brunt of the lending, and they are not regulated. So they lend to all kinds of things, including completely unfeasible things, and including in real estate and housing. So IL&FS has already exploded. Already it has, or imploded, it's already collapsed. We know that that's a big mess now. But there are others that are on the verge of collapse. Diwan Housing Finance, okay, which is one of the biggest housing finance, and a bunch of other NBFCs are actually on the verge of collapse. We're not allowed to talk about it because it's anti-national, it will create panic and so on. But we are actually in a very, very severe crisis of NBFCs, not just banking, but NBFC crisis. In such a situation where all of these NBFCs are also overextended and banks are supposed to clean up their balance sheets, and they discover that they haven't been reporting all their losses properly. You saw 2 days ago, SBI is actually running a loss rather than a profit if it reports all of its NPLs properly. In such a situation, banks are also afraid of lending or unable to lend. And of course, the only people they're willing to lend to are those who don't want to borrow because there is nothing to invest in. So there is a multiple set of forces that now needs to be done. You have to do something to resolve that banking issue. You have to provide more demand for people to feel that they can invest. All of this comes home to roost really about a year ago, I would say. By the middle of 2018, so maybe a year and a half ago, all of this is evident in the economy for those who have eyes to see it. Everything is slowing down, output is slowing down, employment. We know the labor force survey tells us there was an absolute decline in the number of people who had jobs by 9 million. Between 2011-12 and 2017-18, employment declined by 9 million at least. Now that's amazing. This is an economy that is growing. Unemployment fell. Most of it was women, but also men, every category of men also. And of course, as you all know, it was in the papers a lot, the highest unemployment rate that we have ever experienced in 40 years, mostly among educated. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to be unemployed. So that the rates of unemployment, open unemployment, actively looking for work and not finding it, are as high as 30% for educated women in the age group of 20 to 25. So we know that employment had collapsed. We now know that consumption had collapsed. There is a consumption survey that was done by the NSSO, which the government has said we won't bring it out because we think the data is faulty. And why do they think the data is faulty? Because it's showing a decline in consumption. Now, the amazing thing is, of course, it's been leaked after that. So there have been some studies based on that leaked report. And what do they show us? The big decline is in rural areas. And the funny thing is, in rural areas, it's across the board. It's every decile. The richest and the poorest. Everybody's consumption has declined. In fact, the biggest decline is for the richest top 10%. The second biggest decline is for the poorest top 10%, the bottom 10% in the rural areas. And that decline is so strongly related to demonetization. It's evident, right? This is the year, 2017-18 is when all of that I was just describing to you, all of those things happened. in the Indian economy. And that mess in the rural economy, it's very evident in both employment and consumption. In the urban areas, consumption has gone up, especially for the top 10%. No surprises there. Okay? But that's not enough to counteract the overall decline. And that is why we are now in this situation where everything is in that downward loop. And it's a negative synergy, if you like. All of the bad things are feeding into each other. So biscuit consumption is falling, clothing consumption is falling, automobiles, of course, everybody talks about, but more than automobiles, two-wheelers, which is the real indicator of rural demand. Two-wheelers sales started falling well before cars and other things. And so on and so forth. Everything is declining. So much so that the global indicator of recession, I didn't know this earlier, but it's quite interesting. Apparently, the most effective indicator of recession is the sale of male underwear, men's underwear. So globally, when men's underwear sales start falling, then you know that this is a real recession. So in India, men's underwear sales have been falling from January this year. We're in recession. Government can say what it likes, we are in recession. Now, of course, the industrial data are also telling us the same thing. Core industries, other industries, everything is negative now for 3 months in a row. So industrial recession is already there. Macroeconomic recession is probably there. We really cannot trust the GDP data at present, but that's broadly the situation. So it is a crisis, as you can see. It's a crisis in every possible way, and it's a man-made, policy-made crisis. Man-made, true man-made crisis. Okay, what do we do about it? And this is where the extraordinary thing is, that this is a government having created this crisis, has no idea how to resolve it. I have explained to you that the big immediate problem is lack of demand. Lack of demand with farmers, lack of demand in the rural areas, lack of demand in the informal economy, lack of demand across the board, right? What do you have to do that? Provide more demand. Put money, put public money into spending that will generate more demand. Okay, that's the most obvious and easy thing to do, and it's not rocket science, right? It's kind of staring you in the face that this is what needs to be done. So the government needs to put more money into things like the employment guarantee, maybe double, triple the amount, into health and education spending, into even its famous sanitation, actually put money there instead of just talking about Swachh Bharat, actually put budgetary resources into that, into basic infrastructure like proper roads to every village that also provide more employment and so on and so forth. These are easy things to do. There's obviously a good case in this crisis situation to start an urban employment guarantee. All of these would provide demand. Even if you refuse to do anything else, at least do your own promise. Remember, the government brought in PM Kisan just before the election, saying that we will give 60,000 rupees to every... No, sorry, how much? 6,000, sorry, not 60. 6,000 rupees, but at least some money to farmers. They haven't, of course, done that. 20% of PM Kisan money has been spent. 20%. Okay? So they're doing the opposite. Instead, in the middle of this crisis, what do they say? Oh, we will give tax cuts to corporates. We're going to bring down the tax rate, and that will actually help corporates to go out and invest. Corporates are not investing because they're sitting on inventory with nobody to buy their output. Why will they go and invest? They're not anticipating any profit on which they will have to pay tax. So this whole notion is completely crazy. A corporate tax cut will do nothing to raise investment, and of course, as we can now see, it has done nothing to raise investment. It will not have an effect because there is right now this problem that corporates do not feel that there's anyone to buy the output. So what you needed and what you still need is more public spending. What you're getting is the opposite. And here is the other mess. I'll just mention these two more messes and then stop. The other mess that has happened is that the government has really, really messed up its public finances. So I talked to you about how GST destroyed the informal economy, the second big blow to the informal economy. But the crazy thing about this GST is that it also meant a big loss in revenues for the central and state governments. in a way, that's not surprising because the weighted average rate of GST is lower than the earlier sales and excise duties taken together. So that's not surprising. But this is something that should have been factored in. Anyway, it's a big mess. GST revenue collections are something like 30% below target. Last year, they were 40% below target. What did that mean? It meant that the government had much less tax revenues than it expected. It actually had 1.4 percentage points of GDP less than they had planned. So they cut spending. The government last year spent 1.7% less than it was supposed to spend. And where did they cut? They cut in health, they cut in education, they cut in rural development, they cut in social protection, they cut in all the employment-intensive areas. So this government, in the middle of this slowdown and crisis, actually, when it should have been spending much more, it spent less because it had messed up its own public finances. This year, same thing is happening. This year, once again, GST collections well below, and spending also, they're cutting down as a result. So that's the second big mess. The third big mess is something that is directly relevant also for Kerala. So and for Kerala state government employees, which is that this is a government that is the most centralizing that we have seen in independent India. It is trying to put all fiscal, political, all other powers into its own hands. It's completely anti a federal spirit in terms of giving power or what is due to the states. And one of the ways in which it has done that is by reducing the amount that states get to spend. So if you look at what the tax structure of the central government, it has to share its taxes with states, but it doesn't have to share cesses and surcharges. So 40% of the increase in taxes in the last 4 years, or ever since Modi came to power, is in cesses and surcharges. So they're shifting it to things that they don't have to share with the state government. Even when they lowered the tax rate on corporates, they brought it down to 25%, they didn't get rid of the cess and the surcharge. They only lowered the corporate tax rate. If they really wanted to lower the tax rate, and as their gesture, they could have just said, we're eliminating cesses and surcharges, which is 3.5%. They didn't do that. They basically said, everybody gets less, especially the state governments. We will keep the cess and giving state governments less than what is rightfully theirs. Because the Finance Commission cannot actually try and distribute the cesses and surcharges. The second is that they are imposing on the state governments very rigid rules about what they can spend. Now, if the central government won't spend, somebody has to spend. Let the state government spend to let the economy revive. But no, they're saying you have to have zero revenue deficit, zero capital deficit. So state governments are not allowed to spend either. And the latest plum on the cake, or cherry on the cake, or whatever it is that they said, we are not going to give you your dues in terms of GST compensation. Now, this is constitutionally required of them. They promised when the whole GST happened that for a period of 5 years, they would compensate the states for their losses in terms of the GST collection. And as you know, the GST collection is way below. Now they're saying, but we haven't collected enough GST, so we're not going to pay you. They've just announced this. It has got to the point where some state governments, including, I believe, Kerala, are having to approach the Supreme Court, saying, please give us what is our due. So not only have they centralized the resources, tried to prevent state governments from spending more in a period of economic downswing, but now they're not even giving state governments their rightful dues, which would allow them to spend money. Now, what are they thinking? Why are they doing this? It's not just, unfair, unjust, etc. It's macroeconomically stupid. Okay? And I think that's the real problem. We have a macroeconomically stupid government that is incredibly clever at doing divisive measures to distract the population. I think that's a very dangerous situation. And it's very difficult. It's a very difficult situation for state governments to be in. But it is one that, therefore, you can see why I so much appreciate coming to a place like Kerala, because I think Kerala is also showing how you can withstand a lot of this stupidity and madness. Anyway, thank you for